I'm absolutely delighted to welcome back to the channel Vlad Vexler, and I think that many of you will certainly be on board and really keen to see what we have to say. It's been quite a while. Vlad has, of course, as many of you know, struggles with health, but it is always a huge privilege and hugely enlightening to be able to have these conversations. So I'm delighted to welcome him back. Vlad is a social philosopher and unique YouTuber. We have had, I think, 4 or 5 conversations now on the channel. Each one of them has proved to be extremely popular, and I know people have also got a lot of value out of what was said and what was discussed. If you're not following Vlad's channel, absolutely, please make sure you subscribe to his videos. They help to make a lot of sense, especially not just what's happening geopolitically, but about Russia's motivations based on the context of Russia's history as well. Vlad, welcome back.
So good to be with you again, John.
And I think to an extent, I know you didn't predict all the details of where you're at, but you've been talking very eloquently about demographic decline, and I think the incapacity of democracy to deal with the many problems that Western democracies are assailed with. We are, 6 months on from our last conversation, far, far deeper down that rabbit hole. And I think some of the things you talk about are now coming into clearer focus. What's your sense of where we're at?
I still think that we're at the start of a journey out of the bay and into open ocean, where things will get bumpier, but it doesn't mean that we will sink. So if we've progressed, I think we've progressed through what is historically still the beginning phase of a new pattern of realignment globally as a consequence, I argue, of domestic transformation in Western democracies. So we're just at the beginning of the journey. And emotionally, this is one of the hardest times because this really is the time when you feel that the carpet is being pulled from under your feet. And what's really scary about that, I think, is that it's not that you feel the world isn't going as well as I would like, it's that the world isn't making as much sense as I would like. And it's a time when we both need to show incredible compassion to people who are epistemically discombobulated, but also give a little bit of sober sternness about the fact that setting our hair on fire 77 times in a row isn't politically the most effective way that we can react. But this is a time of transformation. And I think everybody watching us has either that feeling or has empathy towards others they know who have that feeling. And there's a lot of this to come, and it'll get harder, but easier also in different ways.
Now, this is an absolutely fascinating point because if we look at the pronouncements today by Pete Hegseth and Trump and so on, it has caused an absolute firestorm of reaction, especially amongst those that are, I would say, predisposed to look negatively on anything that comes out of the Trump regime. My initial take on it, and let's not maybe get into the substance of it because tomorrow there might be completely different pronouncements. But certainly some of the pronouncements today seem to me actually not to be nearly as bad as people are expecting. It clarifies a lot of things we thought might happen, that the US may well withdraw from European security. They may well withdraw, certain direct support that doesn't have any strings attached. I think actually the transparency and the clarity some of these statements bring to be welcome because you know where you are, you can react to it. Is this perhaps better to have that kind of clarity than, say, the last 3 years from Biden, which is, yes, Ukraine, 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 we're aligned with the values, etc., and Ukraine is this and that, and some fairly loose kind of statements, albeit positive, but then the action on the ground doesn't amount to enabling Ukrainian win. Is it better at this stage that we have a cold dose of reality rather than, let's say, groundless hope and rhetoric?
I think it's clearly worse overall, but better in some ways. So I'm a fan of hypocrisy. When you have an empire and I'm using that word fairly neutrally. I think there's lots of very benign things the United States empire has done, including supporting Ukraine. But when you have something like that major power, even the fact that the power talks a predictable game can stabilize the world while that power falls short of the game it talks in its actions. So I think that there is a stabilizing effect in hypocrisy. So let's take an example. We've had a pronouncement today about Ukraine not being welcomed into NATO as a result of a possible deal. Now, in a way, that's not radically discontinuous from the Biden administration, because the Biden position on NATO for Ukraine was no way. But it was a semi-private position, leaving it open for folks in NATO to say we're still aiming for this. And here we have representatives of the Trump administration coming in and saying, no, that's not going to be an outcome of the deal. What I think the key difference between the two approaches, specifically on the NATO membership issue, is that the Trump administration approach represents withdrawal from the pursuit of a self-image by the United States, sometimes real, sometimes hypocritical, as a kind of vanguard for the spread of Western values. They are not going to talk the talk of spreading Western ideas about democracy, Western ideas about security arrangements, unless it explicitly favors the United States. So there is a de-alignment from a certain kind of post-Cold War liberal universalism that was only partly reflected in the reality of US actions, but nevertheless was pretty well reflected in the rhetoric. So it's a move away from that rhetoric. But it's a significant change because words are actions in politics. And this pronouncement by the Trump administration has sent folks in Europe and folks in NATO who were speaking a very different game scrambling. So this deepens the cacophony of Western voices, and it does create more uncertainty. So I'm on the side of the hypocrisy of Biden on this issue, perhaps over, if it's just a straight comparison between that and Trump, over the straight talking of representatives of the Trump administration who say no NATO is an outcome of the deal.
It's interesting because a lot of Ukrainians would actually go with the opposite point of view, which is at this point they want a cold dose of reality so they can plan around it. And I know many Ukrainians were looking towards the departure of the Biden regime with some relief, and they were actually looking towards Trump with some hope. Not just because they thought maybe Trump would be more energetic in supporting them. No, I think they were looking for that clarity. Where we are, where are we? What's realistic? What can we expect? And in one respect, it's interesting because I think part of that is justified. Trump is showing absolutely no interest whatsoever in escalation management. None whatsoever. There's been not a, as far as I can tell, not a single pronouncement really that mirrors the sort of Sullivan type statements and the queasiness that you got from Sullivan when Ukraine was hitting Russian oil infrastructure. There seems to be no such qualms whatsoever. That's not a dynamic recognized by the Trump regime. And indeed, we seem to see far less of the nuclear saber rattling and the sort of, pronouncement of red lines by Putin, maybe because they recognize that that's not going to work on the current administration.
So I'm skeptical about that. I think it will come in if it needs to come in, and it will work. I don't think there is any fundamental change in the way the administration thinks of escalation management. The Kremlin will not do the nuclear saber rattling if Washington is soft enough on it. And so far, we are seeing, while we don't know what exact form the process of negotiations will take, what we're seeing is what I would call some procedural softness. So that's to say there was a conflict between Zelensky and Putin about subjecthood in negotiations. Zelensky's preference was, let's make a deal with the United States and then present it to the Russians and see if they accept it or not. Putin wanted the opposite. He wanted to deal with Trump, not with, but about Ukraine. Now, Trump has spoken to both Zelensky and Putin today, as we know, but the nature of Trump's write-up of each conversation, the length of the write-up, the floweriness of the write-up suggests that Putin is winning this conflict of subjecthood and that Zelensky is probably feeling a little bit left out at the moment, having scrambled for several weeks to lure Trump into taking a more serious look at Ukraine's basic needs and what it even requires for Ukraine to have a proper negotiating position on which it can stand. So the issue of escalation management may just not be coming up at the moment, but I am not persuaded by the fact that, for instance, if it came to arming Ukraine over the next year or two, it wouldn't remain a significant consideration.
Something else that I think escapes notice, and I think it's quite interesting. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about the rare earth metals, minerals, and so on. And again, the reaction of many commentators is a degree of alarm and an accusation that the US is behaving in an imperial, very extraction-led way. That the policy is no longer values-based, but is this pure transactional mentality. I Conversely, I'm not trying to be a contrarian. I see this as a positive because it suggests that there are deals to be made with Trump. It suggests that Zelensky understands the new motivations of the American administration and has something to offer. It also suggests to me that it's possible to do a win-win deal with Trump. He might want to get the upper arm, as it were, upper hand in whatever bargain, but he's open to some kind of win-win concept. My idea, and you may disagree with it, my idea is that Russia is a pre-industrial political mindset and it has no concept of win-win. It works on very much a zero-sum lose-win dynamic. So if Ukraine can still negotiate with Trump on a win-win basis, then this at least is something. This gives them an opportunity, at least, to potentially, let's say, put in place some kind of lend-lease deal with rare earths as collateral for it.
I think the broad principle that we're looking at a much more transactional administration is right. And I think that the extra observation that a transactional administration may be more unpredictable in some ways, but also more transparent in others, I think that's also fair. But the trouble is that the win-win we'd need to have is a win-win between Putin and Zelensky. And what we've got at the moment is a situation where it's very difficult to imagine a reconciliation of the conflict right now that works for both Ukraine and Russia, simply because Russia's aspiration is essentially the destruction of effective politics in Ukraine, if not territorial conquest. So quite certainly there is this possibility for transactional appeal to Trump, and Zelensky has been trying that, but that requires leverage, and leverage is dependent on your relative strength and weakness vis-a-vis the other side. And so here we simply run into the question of how does the balance of economic stability on both sides weigh up? How does the balance of mobilization capacity on both sides weigh up? How does the balance of, prospects of political events, unpredictable political events, and destabilization run on both sides? where is the front currently? So we run into the problem that Zelensky is indeed scrambling for leverage to gain a more positive outcome for Ukraine with a transactional Trump. But so far, everything he has grasped has not quite made a difference, and it's somewhat exceeded his what he's put in his hands has exceeded his grasp, and it's fallen back out of his hands. So I am a pessimist about where we are with this, especially as it has been historically my view that Ukraine needs security guarantees. And the question arises, what leverage could Zelensky exercise to make not just Trump, but the West disposed to giving Ukraine the kind of security guarantees that would not leave it undefended against a future Putin invasion. So I see a quite accommodating approach to Putin by Trump at the moment procedurally. I think we want to be cautious about what the substance is. I wouldn't get utterly hysterical and say that Trump is simply selling out the farm to Putin, because it's clear that there are going to be some sticks there, and the Trump administration is committed to being stern on sanctions. But at the same time, Putin is being given some procedural priority in the way talks about negotiations are going on. NATO membership is being ruled out by the Trump administration. There is no real prospect for Ukraine to gain nuclear weapons soon. And the prospect of Western troops on the ground that are neither American nor NATO is a possibility, but a distant possibility at the moment. The Europeans are in all kinds of disarray when it comes to having the capacity for that. And so where we're drifting at the moment is, unfortunately, that Ukraine's best bet will be to be armed well enough by the West. I still remain open to the security guarantee scenario, but that's where we're going. And what Zelensky will continue doing over the coming weeks is scrambling for more leverage. But the trouble is that we in the West, and us Europeans in particular, have not done enough to put Ukraine in a strong enough position over 3 years, while knowing that we're in the process of historical transformation with the prospect of US retreat.
It is quite extraordinary, isn't it? And even at this point in time, one of the reasons why I think some are having a hysterical reaction to what is clearly a very, obvious US withdrawal from directly funding European defense is this question of whether Europe's actually going to step up and actually do what is required to secure, its territories, collective territories. But also, we know that there are territories that are far, far along the road to making not just accommodations with Putin's regime, but willing to sort of, roll over and let their tummies be tickled, as it were, as weird as that image might be. Maybe I shouldn't have said it that way. But someone like Orban, Fico, Serbia is perhaps looking a little bit dodgy, that regime may well fall there. But certainly there's a concerted effort by Putin, I would say, to install quasi-puppet regimes, or certainly compliant regimes throughout Europe. And in those countries he cannot control, destabilize. I mean, it seems a classic Russian imperial mechanic, but it's working remarkably well in numerous places.
Well, partly because it's overwhelmingly domestically driven. And I have had the pessimistic view for a couple of years on my channels that the default trend for the Putin regime is reintegration with the West over the coming half decade. Now, I don't want to exaggerate that, but I mean partial reintegration with the West relative to, again, the partial exclusion it has been on the end of. So Putin's theory of success here is rather hysterical and exaggerated. It's sort of the view that our democracies are on an inexorable path to collapse. But if we dismiss that somewhat methodological assessment of Putin's and just look at what's happening in our own democracies, we can see that things are getting worse, that we are losing trust in institutions progressively. We can see that we have Musk with his baby on his shoulders in the White House answering questions about important regions of the world, essentially on behalf of the President of the United States. I'm not saying anything special about Musk's power. I'm just saying that the theatrics of this are only possible under conditions of sort of late decline of empire and under conditions of degradation in our democracies. So while Putin is strictly speaking wrong in his theory about us, he's got the hold of the right stick the wrong way around. What's causing all of this is the destabilization of our democracies at home because of the untethering of various kinds of social fabrics, because of the state of social media, because of mechanisms of exclusion, because of the profound degree of various individualism-driven ideologies in the West that are undermining ideas of solidarity and the public good. And what's basically happened to Ukraine, and this has been true with Biden and with Trump, is that it's got unlucky to have been caught up in a very existential situation at a moment of transformation in the West. And that's, I think, why we shouldn't over panic, because this is just a difficult historical moment to have been caught up in, whether we would have got a Trump or a Kamala Harris administration. I think Trump's much worse for Ukraine overall, but the broad pattern of Western domestic discombobulation and international retreat would have been the same. And that's sheer bad luck. And it's an extremely precarious position in which to be. And, you know, when you asked the question before last, I was just sitting here profoundly empathizing what it means to be a Ukrainian, because the fate of your nation is in your hands, is dependent on what you do and what you say, how you conceive of it, but it's also equally dependent on the domestic politics in major Western capitals. And that's a position of really sort of, anguish-inducing precarity.
And Ukrainians are, I think this goes unrecognized, they are defending a revolutionary process that began with even prior to the Orange Revolution, but essentially kicked off the Orange Revolution. It's an attempt to shake off the influence of oligarchy, to shake off a sort of dysfunctional state, de-Russify in some ways, their society. As it emerged from the Soviet Union, and they're still on that trajectory of revolution. And I think many of the people I speak to were on Maidan or were, had people on the square. There's still this intimate connection, and it provides energy. And some of the resilience that they're going through now still owes its source to Maidan and this desire not to be in a society where organic politics aren't possible or are persecuted, as they're starting to be in Georgia. That still provides this energy to survive despite the extreme exhaustion that's going through. And that's interesting when you compare it to, I think, in our societies where we have more mature democracy, where perhaps a lot of the mechanics and benefits of democracy are kind of taken for granted and then even maligned in some respects now. How do we capture some of that energy and belief in fundamental values of democracy and democracy as being maybe, as I think it was Churchill, the worst possible system, bar all other known systems of governance?
So I think it's important that we can get inspired, but it's also important to not get overexcited about this, because there are limits to, if you like, ideological inspiration when some of the factors that are driving, right, democratic decline in the West are to do with social and economic forces, rather than us not thinking about things the right way, or rather than us being dissuaded from one ideology into another. So I would say that 84.3% of the challenge we face is to do with, I would say, fairly objective social and economic forces that have made people feel excluded, disempowered, resentful. And you're not going to persuade them into some kind of pro-democratic ideology unless you address their core civic needs. But that leaves about 15% of room for inspiration. And quite certainly, one form of social mobilization in Ukraine can be a model to us, and that's Ukraine's civic nationalism. Um, and what I think it can teach us is the idea that the value of solidarity across citizens um, is a profoundly important value and can be linked to constructive rather than destructive patriotism. There's a lot to learn there for us. At the same time, there are other modes of nationalism in Ukraine. I think there are three modes of nationalism. There is what I would call civic nationalism, from which we can learn. There is ethnic nationalism, it's also very present. And there is also a certain mode of what I call hyper-identity politics that's actually not Ukrainian, but it's come into Ukraine from the West, and it plays a role in some of the way conversations in Ukraine about de-Russification and decommunization are framed. So one of these three can certainly be a teacher for us. But if we speak directly about social forces in Ukraine as far as outcomes for Ukrainians are concerned, then I do think that the quality of Ukraine's domestic politics is a huge factor when it comes to predicting what the outcome is going to be for Ukraine's polity over the next decade. And that's simply because Putin's central plan is for Ukrainian politics to become dysfunctional. And the more functional Ukrainians are in their domestic affairs, the more they're able to speak to each other, the more they're able to address this balance of the authoritarian tendencies of mobilization during war on the one hand. On the other hand, the tendency to want to make the country to all speak together and even disagree with each other without putting the national security on the line. All of that is hugely important and will play a major factor in whether Ukraine has a good or a bad outcome. And fundamentally, what Ukraine needs, I think, is two conversations. One is what Ukraine is, and two is how it sees itself in the world. And that can actually include Ukrainians thinking about the international order and giving their ideas about what it should look like. Not their ideas just about Ukraine, but their ideas about what security in Eastern Europe looks like, what security in Europe looks like. And so a considerable degree of boldness of that kind, I think, is also something we haven't seen enough of, and would be very welcome from Ukrainians, especially as the West is ready to listen because it is itself in a moment of transition and disarray.
And looking for leadership. I think that's the interesting point about leadership, isn't it? Its absence isn't necessarily felt until you're in a crisis mode. But when leaders do emerge, I think people gravitate towards it. And that's why many people in, I think, the activist community have latched on to Ukraine, because they see individuals in action. They see a society that has some resilient qualities under extreme duress, and the emergence of leaders, not a single leader. Yes, there's Zelensky, etc. But, you know, as one of the people on the channel said that Ukraine is a nation of Zelenskys. They only survive because there are many thousands of people willing to take up that mantle of leadership, and it's extremely attractive, and perhaps it's apparent in its absence actually in many sort of Western democracies at this phase or this particular period in history in which they find themselves.
But the footnote is that leadership requires vision. And what we need pretty much from every party in our public sphere, globally and domestically, is less critique of what's wrong, but a combination of critique of what's wrong with a vision for an alternative future. And I always emphasize how little of that we have been hearing from Western leaders. In fairness, in my view, from Ukrainian leaders too. And we've also heard literally none of that from any of the Russian opposition, virtually none of
I
it.
was about to mention that
So
too. Yeah, yeah.
what we've got is this unbelievable vacuum. And it's in this vacuum that trumps of various kinds occur. And it is very important to critique them, especially when they begin to break institutions in a way that feels potentially irreparable. But at the same time, you have to offer a vision to the country. So the Democrats in the United States need to offer a vision that's an alternative to Trump, that somehow addresses the feelings of citizens between the coasts who feel they've been in various ways left out and left in a kind of unarticulate limbo, alienated from politics. And on the global stage, conversations, as long as they're vaguely realistic, about how a new global order might look like, even if we can only make partial steps towards it, are very important. And that's why, as I've just said a moment ago, what would be welcome from Ukrainian leadership isn't just talk about Ukraine's needs and Ukraine's position, but actually a more global talk about what kind of world Ukraine sees itself fitting into over the coming decade or two, and then an attempt to politicize that conversation with Western leaders. Otherwise, we are sort of helplessly drifting down the river, probably not toward a waterfall, but towards some really bumpy waters. And we're in a state of somewhat depoliticized passengers, and that even includes many of our leaders.
And I think that's interesting because Zelensky started to hint towards it. I mean, it's not a comprehensive solution, it's not a holistic solution, but he started to put hints in his peace plan about 6 months ago of a role for Ukraine in a post-war European security architecture, even to the point of Ukrainian troops being on the soil and having bases in European countries to really integrate in that sense, as well as the military-industrial complex. And I got the impression there were quite a few in the sort of analyst community and political community that maybe didn't take affront at this, but they just thought that was presumptuous. And yet it seems to me an extraordinarily realistic prospect, in fact, given the huge number of people under arms in Ukraine and the direct experience of conflict they would have had, which is lacking in Western militaries, but it displayed at least a hint of the kind of leadership or thinking or vision. But as you say there, it has to go far beyond just security and the military. There has to be a vision for other parts of society, which is perhaps lacking.
And as you know, I think that putting aside the particulars of that proposal, when such conversations happen, the typical fault with them isn't that they're happening, but they don't go far enough. And you've got to have a degree of historical clarity and boldness there, which is very absent. But when little sort of throwaway expressions of it occur, I believe we should actually encourage them. And as you know, having mentioned the Russian opposition, one of the stark facts about them is how little they have spoken about anything that isn't Russia. And largely they've done that out of fear. Well, we can't even do anything about Putin. What else are we going to say to anybody? But the truth is that a lot of the challenges we face are global. And the reality, it's only if you think globally and have ambitious conversations about what kind of world you want to see that you can actually begin um, increasing your efficacy at displacing somebody like Putin. That, for example, would require them to have a conversation about what Russia's security needs are if you strip them away from sort of ghastly imperial aspirations and how such needs would fit into some kind of stable European security order. So the Russian opposition are welcome to say that. Ukrainians are welcome to say that. We're welcome to say that. We're not doing enough of this, and that's a problem. And there's a kind of self-perpetuating effect of powerlessness. The more we drift down the river, the more we feel that there's nothing we can do about it. But, as much as we all sit around here, make predictions about what will happen in the future, it is to a good extent, now this is a very fraught word, but it is to a good extent up to us. And what happens is, to a good extent, a reflection of the kinds of behaviors and mental states in which you find not just people in leadership, but large populations in different countries.
And of course, Putin doesn't want us to have these solution-oriented conversations where people who might be on a sort of left or right trajectory, can come together and actually discuss problems and solutions in more of an evidence-based way. He doesn't want that kind of cooperation and trust to exist because there's no role for his system there. There's no psychological hook that he can use to sort of destabilize his adversaries. The trouble is we seem to fall into the trap. We do him a huge favor by labeling our adversaries as fascists or this or that. And it raises ourselves up onto a moral pedestal, and and we fall into that trap anyway in our sort of our left right oriented political systems. And of course social media seems to be geared towards conflict and even leveraging sort of hate and division as part of the algorithmic mechanic. I mean, this is Putin's playground. I mean, we've created an extraordinary weaponization of our systems almost inadvertently, and it seems to go against the process that is required, which is building trust, debating solutions, experimenting based on evidence, where it seems to be moving very far away from that.
The problem with othering Trump voters, for instance, isn't that it's unfair to Trump. There's nothing wrong with being unfair to Trump. He is a post-truth authoritarian buffoon. But the problem is that othering and demonizing Trump voters, as we sometimes do, prevents us from reflecting on the explanation for what is happening and invites us to see what's happening as a kind of mysterious outbreak of irrationality combined with a small dollop of malign foreign interference in some cases, and dismiss it as an aberration which should be followed, if the world's in good order, by a restoration of reality. And so this perception of Trump as something from which should follow a reversion to normal, because he's completely a sort of a left field thing thrown at us by history, that prevents us from explaining how it is that the Democrats so spectacularly lost and deserved to lose, in my opinion. Didn't deserve to lose to Trump. Trump's much more destructive for the United States, but deserved to lose in the sense that there wasn't a vision for America presented there. There was a lack of a capacity to connect with working class American voters, a lack of a capacity to speak to the country as a whole. There was a profound failure that led to an eminently beatable candidate like Trump winning. This is the story. The story isn't Trump's victory. The story is that the Democrats lost. And the problem with othering or demonizing our political opponents too strongly isn't that it's unfair to their leaders, who often are indeed badly behaved chances, but that it stops us from giving an explanation for what's gone wrong. And you sort of end up with the thought that the explanation is that fellow citizens have gone potty and given up on liberal values because they're irrational. Whereas in fact, there are really understandable grounds, right, for citizens to feel alienated, resentful about the decades-long process of hyperglobalization that left a lot of citizens feeling excluded in a kind of post-industrial age, and with the feeling that none of these policies were a result of a democratic consultation with the population. So there are these legitimate grievances that you have to talk through with your population. And so that's the risk of othering too strongly. It's that it undermines our chances of beating Trump. I mean, we've spent 4 years during the Biden administration othering Trump, and he ended up winning. So what we need is an understanding of how you re-engage with citizens around their actual concerns, and whether it might not mean reevaluating some policies, whether it's immigration policy or free trade policy, that have been assumed to be a kind of version of normal because they're dictated by, let's say, considerations about what the economy needs and so on. So that's the problem with othering. And even the same goes with Putin, right? We can call him out for being um, a brutal tyrant, but we should always try to keep an eye on his actual motivations, the structural trends that his regime is driving him toward, and so on. And that takes us back to our previous conversation about Trump and the worry that Trump isn't on top of any of that because he personally isn't terribly fond of Zelensky. And while he doesn't personally know Putin well, he kind of rather likes the idea of Putin that could blind him to, again, this sort of explanation. Because if othering Trump voters is setting up with some kind of a false misrepresentative image that's negative, in Trump's case, the risk with Putin is that he sets up a misrepresentative and excessively positive image of both Putin's aspirations and what Putin is locked into in virtue of various things he needs, like maintaining power at home.
And he understands that flattery is a good way to get through to Trump. And indeed, he seems to have greased that wheel just yesterday by releasing one of the sort of US hostages of the, Russian legal system. And that, he's giving, if it may not be recognized by everyone, but he's gifting a PR coup to Trump. He's giving him something that he can sort of brag about. And this seems to have paid dividends. We see a slew of tweets today. That are not condemning Putin, quite the opposite, talking about how, some kind of accommodation may be possible and et cetera, and harking back to the Second World War and the sacrifices and all this kind of stuff. Putin seems to be able to play that piano very effectively when he wants to.
And here there's the risk of Trump spending too much time in a room with Putin alone without some of his team and some of his advisors. And there is also the reality, just on the basis of what we witnessed, moments before we started recording these mini essays by Trump summarizing his calls with Zelensky and Putin, is that he has proposed that Putin visits the United States and implied that he's going to be visiting Russia, perhaps on the 9th of May celebrations together with Xi. And that's a huge scoop for Putin in exchange so far for no concessions. Now, I'm not saying that's going to change the fate of history or do some kind of cataclysmic damage to Ukraine if Putin goes with Trump to his parade. But this is certainly, a very unlovely case of a procedural advantage to Putin, and a couple of scoops for Putin in exchange for no concessions so far, whatever.
And this brings us on probably to the sort of last sort of topics we'll be able to sort of cover today, I guess. Well, I wanted to cover Tucker Carlson and the liar in chief, as I'm calling him there, because, he plays a role in this ecosystem with such outrageous kind of falsehoods. But nonetheless, it's a way to sort of launder certain narratives that then going to get toned down, but they're still lies, but they're smaller lies, but they enter the ecosystem. I don't know if you want to comment on Tucker, because the big question I wanted to end on really
Mhm.
was this idea of a negotiated solution, and the state of the Russian economy. I don't know. Do you want to have a crack at
Well,
Tucker Carlson
on
first?
Tucker, the basic problem is that we are um, in a situation in which our public squares, which are social media companies, are exercising an enormous amount of arbitrary or arguably illegitimate political power. I mean, the extraordinary political power Twitter X is currently exercising is remarkable. And it's an example of a kind of oligarchic deformation.
And the
Now,
podcasting, the sort of alt-right podcasting ecosystem,
and the,
again,
the
very
the
effective.
state
Yeah,
of this online, the
yeah.
state of the podcast world is scarily entrepreneurial. And what Tucker is a splendid entrepreneur. The trouble is that when you go around riding algorithms, you tend to end up believing what the algorithms want you to say, or at least half believing it. It's always very difficult to accuse people of, you know, uh, positive lies and deception. There's some of that too, undoubtedly. But Tucker is riding algorithms for the benefit of self-perpetuation in the informational environment without caring that much really about Russia, Ukraine, or Europe, or NATO, or anybody. And the trouble is that there's no reason why that kind of content can't do extraordinarily well. The trouble is that if 95% of our information environment is made up of that type of content, then that's not compatible with the sustenance of democracy, because democracy needs a semblance of democratic culture. And that needs a semblance of a conversation has two features. It is a little bit truthfully responsible, and it is quite collective. And what we have is a proliferation of pockets of discourse that are completely removed from other pockets of discourse, and an untethering of these pockets from basic facts, as well as a desire to be robust enough and try to make an interpretation of the world that's right. There's not just basic fact, it's also that there's such a thing as the disposition to be truthful about the world, which requires not being accurate, but at least always making an effort to be accurate, you know? And there is no solution to this. And this state of the internet is one of the 4 or 5 pillars of democratic decline that at the moment we can clearly observe, but not do, unfortunately, much about.
And we could talk at length about sort of the parallels with the 1930s, the introduction of radio, cinema, which at their outset were not regulated in the same way, and cinema wasn't. But over time, regulation sort of comes in. But the 30s is a period of extraordinary social mobility. You've got economic crisis, you've got massive technological change. That all feeds into this idea that, again, reminiscent of now, which is of democratic decline, and that democracy is enfeebled in its last legs. And you have, fascistic ideas coming in, suggesting that the next evolution of the human species is going to be non-democratic. It has to have a different kind of energy about it. There's some echoes, at least. I won't say it's a repeated pattern, but there are echoes of these issues now. 2008 financial crisis, COVID. Massive technological disruption, social change, mobility, identity change. We seem to have some of the same kind of elements present that are triggering extreme instability.
And we need to try to do something about that. And the problem is that our leverage is limited, but it certainly means us doing a better job with the journalistic profession, being both more modestly committed to getting basic facts right, but also being bolder in calling things out for what they are. Because there's this extraordinary trend of co-option and normalization that I'm seeing. One of the stark things about what happened with USAID in the last few weeks is how many leaders of NGOs that are tied up with USAID were silent because they were scared to jeopardize um, absolutely essential work that they were doing. And they were unable to call things out for what they were. And that's a ubiquitous pattern we're going to see across the board. We're going to see authoritarian behavior repeatedly not being called out because people are in a precarious enough position that they're fearful of doing so. So we certainly need boldness, and we also need democratic regeneration, which really means re-injecting local enthusiasm into our democracies, re-injecting new complementary institutions like citizens' assemblies into our democracies that increase the capacity of citizens to feel that they can touch politics. And depending on how well we do with that, will depend on how rapidly our democratic decline progresses. But as I say, I think that we're at the beginning of a trend that I think is a negative trend. We can't stop it from being negative. We can just slow it down. So it will get worse. But we also have to understand that we're coming out of a relatively positive historical bubble. If we compare ourselves to Europeans walking around on the ruins of the Second World War, we're in a better place than them. So that kind of historical perspective about humans living through hardship and extreme social, political, and economic uncertainty in the past and still keeping on going with hope about the future. We can take inspiration from that and understand that while things are trending badly, that doesn't mean we're going to end up in catastrophe. I mean, worst case scenario where we're heading for in Europe is that a large fraction, quarter to half of European democracies, North American democracies that are currently democracies collapse by 2040. So, A, that's not societal collapse. Still going to be going to the theater in 2040, even if you're living under Orban in Canada. And it might not happen everywhere, even if it happens on a worse scale than we might anticipate. And there will be still, I think, some possibility for reversal of this as well. So that's bad, but it's not catastrophic. It's not some monster coming to eat you in the middle of the night. So we need to understand that as physiologically jarring as this moment is, there's a lot to play for. This isn't a zero-sum game. And, it's always possible to make your democracy, if you like, 1% stronger or to arrest its decline by 1%. And we should be working on that, also knowing that our capacity to act effectively on the foreign stage is dependent on that.
And the very last question, this maybe quick, may not, I'm not sure. And this is what I'm thinking of as the hard problem. So Kellogg has come in with, I think, reasonable information and understanding about what Russia's been up to in Ukraine and a reasonably clear-eyed understanding of what may be required to stop it. But I think still there is a degree of naivety, even with the information he's getting about how easy it was going to be to get Putin to negotiate. And of course, things have changed over the last couple of months. The economic situation in Russia is showing indications of, let's say, precipitous decline, but certainly it's getting more challenging there. More details have come to light about the financial economic bubble that Putin seems to have created by channeling, far more funds that are visibly seen in the budget towards the military-industrial complex, which kind of suggests at this point that if the war was to stop, if there was no longer a requirement for the war economy, then Russia would experience extreme financial duress. And many of the enterprises that have been given, I would say, limitless credit guarantees would no longer be able to pay those because the high margins they're earning on keeping the whole war machine going would not be there. It suggests to me, at least, that Putin's got some understanding now that he needs war to sustain his regime, and it may not survive peace. Do you detect that from the materials that you observe?
I think that in broad parameters, it's true that the Putin regime is dependent on either escalation or war for medium-term sustenance. But I think we need to look at it in a more detailed way. Putin's biggest fear, I think, and I made a video about this about a week ago on the main channel about negotiations with Trump, is a fear that he gets something wrong in his dialogue with himself. And I say that because of how grandiosely out of touch with reality Putin is in some ways. He's a rational actor, but he is addressing himself to history and having conversations with himself about his and Russia's historical destiny. In some ways, Trump and Zelensky are secondary actors, even if Putin is so enamored by any respect by Trump bestowed upon him, he still thinks he's dealing with bigger historical forces here rather than talking to some kind of contingent political actor. What Putin is afraid of is that he agrees to a deal that seems to him to be more toxic for Ukraine and more benign for Russia than it actually is. He knows that there is uncertainty there, and he knows that there's a degree of unpredictability about how things pan out. So his default position, I still believe, even as negotiations happen, is to use negotiations to win the war, to negotiate without negotiating, as it were, without wanting to negotiate a stable resolution to the conflict, because he remains committed to gaining political control over Ukraine. But while he does that, he is very open to a plan B, which is to indeed take a deal as long as he thinks that the level of toxicity that deal generates is less for Russia and more for Ukraine. And his fear is that he makes an error about that he misjudges a deal as being more toxic for Ukraine than it is and less toxic for Russia than it is. And I think that he is thinking, this is my speculative interpretation, I'm not in his mind, but I think he has been thinking intensely about how to not make that mistake. And also, I think with a degree of insecurity that a mistake like that can't entirely be avoided. What do I see are Putin's concerns at the moment domestically, whatever happens with the war? I think that Putin is concerned but not alarmed by Russia's economic crisis, because he thinks that worst case scenario, he'll be able to repress his way through it via a series of totalitarian turns. I think he is quite concerned about how he'll be reading opinion polls. And opinion polls in Russia are, in good part, in fact, just a mechanism for the regime to generate a fake consensus that can then be sold both to the population and to the regime members themselves and to the West about Russians being behind Putin. But I think Putin is concerned about what he perceives to be as fatigue with the war. It doesn't necessarily translate into Russians being anti-war. They're not pro-anti-war, it seems to me, for the most part. They have some feelings like maybe not wanting to lose the war badly. But he perceives fatigue there. And that makes him concerned about carrying on the war without further politicization of the population and some further totalitarian turns. At the same time, he also has the concern you've articulated, which is what happens if direct hostilities cease for a while. And there he'll be thinking that he will need to continue to keep putting the economy on military rails. He will need to continue trending in a direction that's compatible with Russia needing to be prepared for a large-scale conflict with the West in the future. And he will want any sort of demilitarization of the economy to be to be partial and gradual. So I think that's going to be the story. I don't, whatever happens with the war, Russia moves off these rails towards militarizing the economy and increasingly militarizing and politicizing the um, society to some extent too. So that's at least the beginning of that conversation as I see it.
That's probably something we'll have to pick up as this torrent of news has come in today, with Trump's reactions to the phone calls, Pete Hegseth's announcements. I think we're going to have to pick this up as things become clearer over the coming weeks and months. But to conclude, I mean, many Ukrainians I speak to are still perhaps more optimistic now than they were under Biden, and they still feel that clarity is something they can plan for, and honesty, even if it's not exactly going their way. But that remains to be seen. We're at very uncertain times.
And I think
Vlad,
now Ukraine needs to try to inflect the West towards security through security guarantees rather than security merely through arming Ukraine more.
yes, and that's the tricky one. We'll pick that one up because I think that's the one that the West is going to really struggle with. Thank you so much for coming back on the channel. Always a massive, massive pleasure, and of course, a huge privilege to be able to dive into your brain and get your thoughts on these issues, and hopefully bring some clarity to the news froth that we have to wade through daily. Vlad, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.